In 1968, a woman in Harlingen, Texas, pulled a grease-stained spiral notebook from her kitchen shelf every single evening. Each recipe inside fit on half a page, and not one of them took more than 10 minutes at the stove. She could feed 6 people and clean the comal before the youngest grandchild finished washing his hands. Those notebooks were never published. They passed hand to hand, mother to daughter, comadre to comadre, copied in pencil on pages held together with rubber bands. The recipes inside were fast because the women who wrote them had families to raise and no time to waste. And they were brilliant because those women understood flavor in a way no culinary school ever taught. So hit subscribe, because here are 30 forgotten Mexican 10-minute recipes you could only find in old cookbooks. Number 30. Salsa de molcajete. Before the blender existed in most Mexican kitchens, every salsa started the same way. A handful of tomatoes charred directly over the burner, 2 or 3 chiles de árbol toasted until they crackled, and a clove of garlic dropped into the stone mortar. The molcajete did the rest. You pressed and twisted, and in 5 minutes you had a salsa with a texture no machine could replicate, rough and chunky with bits of charred skin still folded in. Old cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s did not even list the blender as an option. They assumed you had the stone bowl sitting on your counter because every kitchen did. By the 1980s, most families had switched to electric blenders, and the molcajete moved to the shelf as decoration. But anyone who has tasted the difference knows the stone version carries a deeper, smokier flavor that a spinning blade simply cannot produce. The volcanic rock itself seasons the salsa in a way that nothing else can. Number 29. Fideo seco. This was the dish that stretched $1 further than anything else in the pantry. A nest of thin vermicelli toasted golden in a spoonful of oil, then simmered in tomato sauce with a pinch of cumin until the liquid disappeared and every strand was coated red. The whole thing took 8 minutes. Fideo seco appeared in nearly every handwritten recipe collection from the Rio Grande Valley in the 1960s and 1970s, often listed simply as Fideo with no other instruction, because every woman who read it already knew what to do. Some families added a diced potato to make it heartier. Others crumbled queso fresco on top just before serving. The dish vanished from restaurant menus because it looked too plain to charge money for. But in homes across South Texas, it never actually left. Your abuela probably made it twice a week without ever thinking of it as a recipe at all. Number 28. Papas con rajas. Roasted poblano peppers cut into strips, tossed into a skillet with sliced potatoes that had already been parboiled, and finished with a pour of cream or a handful of shredded cheese. 10 minutes if the potatoes were soft. Cookbooks from Jalisco and central Mexico in the 1960s listed this as a filling for tacos. But in Texas, border towns, it became a meal on its own, served with a stack of flour tortillas still warm from the comal. The peppers gave it heat without burning, and the cream made it rich enough to satisfy anyone after a 12-hour day. It fell out of fashion when faster convenience foods arrived, but the flavor was never matched by anything that came in a box or a frozen bag. Number 27. Enfrijoladas. Think of enchiladas, but replace the chili sauce with a thick, smooth black bean puree. That was enfrijoladas. Corn tortillas dipped one by one into a warm bean sauce, folded or rolled, then topped with crumbled cheese and a drizzle of crema. A 1974 community cookbook from Oaxacan families in East Los Angeles included this recipe with a note that read, "Para cuando no hay carne," meaning for the days when there was no meat. It was never a sacrifice. The bean sauce was seasoned with epazote and a whole dried chili, and it had a richness that made the tortilla feel like the center of the meal instead of a wrapper around something else. Most families could assemble the whole plate in under 7 minutes using beans left over from the day before. The dish faded from public view as enchiladas in red and green sauce took over every menu. but Enfrijoladas remain the quieter, deeper cousin that has always deserved the spotlight. Number 26. Huevos con nopales. Cactus paddles grew along fences and roadsides across northern Mexico and South Texas, and every old cookbook from the region included at least one recipe for them. The simplest was huevos con nopales. You diced the paddles, rinsed away the natural slime, sautéed them with onion and serrano pepper until they were tender, then scrambled in 2 or 3 eggs. 7 minutes, start to finish. The nopales added a green, slightly tart bite that cut through the richness of the eggs, and the whole dish cost almost nothing to make. Families in Nuevo León and Tamaulipas served this for breakfast and dinner alike. The printed versions from the 1950s are a reminder of how naturally this ingredient fit into everyday cooking, long before it became a trendy health food sold in upscale grocery stores. Number 25. Gorditas de manteca. These were not the stuffed gorditas you find at restaurants today. The old cookbook version was simpler. Masa mixed with a generous spoonful of lard, a pinch of salt, patted thick by hand, and cooked on a dry comal until the outside crackled and the inside stayed soft and warm. Some versions from Coahuila in the 1960s called for a tablespoon of piloncillo grated into the dough, making them faintly sweet. Others folded in chicharron bits for texture and salt. Either way, the gordita was ready to eat in under 10 minutes, and it needed nothing else on the plate. The lard was the secret. It made the masa tender in a way that oil or butter could not replicate. When health campaigns in the 1980s and 1990s pushed families away from animal fats, gorditas de manteca quietly disappeared. The irony is that many of those families replaced lard with hydrogenated vegetable shortening, which turned out to be far worse. Number 24. Picadillo rapido. Ground beef browned in a skillet with diced potato, tomato, onion, and a spoonful of cumin. That was picadillo, and in most Mexican-American households from the 1950s through the 1980s, it was the weeknight dinner that appeared more often than any other meal. 10 minutes was generous. A practiced cook could have it done in 7. Old cookbooks from San Antonio and the Valley often listed it under carne molida, with variations that included raisins, green olives, or diced carrots depending on the region the family came from. A version from a 1963 church cookbook in Corpus Christi called for a single chopped apple, which sounds unusual until you taste the way the sweetness balances the cumin and the tomato. Picadillo filled tacos, topped tostadas, stuffed chiles, and sometimes just sat on a plate next to rice and beans with no apology. It has not entirely disappeared, but the speed of the original 10-minute version, made without prepackaged seasoning packets, is something most modern kitchens have let go of. Number 23. Chiles toreados. The name means bullfighter peppers, and the technique was exactly that bold. Whole serrano or jalapeno peppers thrown into a screaming hot skillet with a drizzle of oil, pressed flat with a spatula, and blistered until the skin blackened in spots. Then a squeeze of lime and a shower of coarse salt. Done. 3 minutes. Old cookbooks rarely printed this as a standalone recipe because it was considered a condiment, not a dish. But in homes across Jalisco and Sinaloa, a plate of chiles toreados next to a stack of tortillas and a bowl of beans was a complete dinner. The charring unlocked a sweetness in the pepper that raw heat could never reach, and the lime pulled it all together into something that tasted like summer. No one who grew up eating these ever needed a recipe to remember how they were made. Number 22. Arroz con leche rapido. This is one of those dishes that every Mexican grandmother made differently, and every single version was correct. The quick stovetop arroz con leche found in old cookbooks bears almost no resemblance to the slow-baked rice puddings of European tradition. It was faster, looser, and meant to be eaten warm from the pot with a spoon, not chilled overnight in a porcelain ramekin. The method was simple. Leftover cooked rice went into a saucepan with whole milk, a cinnamon stick, a strip of orange peel, and sugar. You stirred it over medium heat for 8 to 10 minutes until the milk thickened and the rice swelled into a creamy porridge. Some families added a beaten egg yolk in the last minute for richness. Others folded in raisins or a splash of vanilla. A 1959 recipe notebook from a family in Aguascalientes included a version sweetened with piloncillo instead of white sugar, which gave the pudding a dark caramel color and a depth that white sugar could never reach. The dish carried weight well beyond the kitchen. Arroz con leche was what a mother made when a child was sick, what appeared at the table after a funeral, what a grandmother stirred while telling stories about her own childhood in another state or another country. It was comfort food in the truest sense, and its simplicity was the entire point. You did not need special ingredients or expensive equipment. You needed rice, milk, cinnamon, and 10 minutes of patience while you stood at the stove and stirred. By the 1990s, instant pudding mixes and store-bought flan had largely replaced it on the dessert table. The original recipe required stirring, and stirring required someone standing at the stove, and standing at the stove required a pace of life that most families no longer kept. But the taste of warm arroz con leche with real cinnamon bark and fresh orange peel is something no box mix has ever come close to reproducing. If you grew up with it, you already know that. Number 21. Tostadas de sardina. Open a can of sardines, mash them with a fork, add diced tomato, onion, jalapeno, and a squeeze of lime, then spread it on a crispy tostada. That was the entire recipe. 5 minutes, possibly less. Sardines were a pantry staple in Mexican households through the 1960s and 1970s. Because they were inexpensive, they kept without refrigeration, and they carried enough protein to anchor a full meal. Old cookbooks from the border region listed sardine tostadas alongside tuna salad and deviled eggs as dependable comida rápida, for days when there was no time to cook anything elaborate. The dish fell out of fashion as canned fish lost its everyday appeal. But the combination of oily sardines with fresh lime and the crunch of a fried tortilla is one of the most satisfying bites in Mexican home cooking. Today, sardines are making a comeback, decades after Abuelas already knew exactly what they were worth. Number 20. Quesadillas de flor de calabaza. Squash blossoms stuffed into a corn tortilla with Oaxacan string cheese, folded and toasted on a comal until the cheese melted and the flour wilted into something silky and faintly sweet. In Mexico City, this was street food. In the countryside, it was what you made when the garden was producing faster than you could eat. The flowers had to be used the same day they were picked, so there was no saving them. A 1972 cookbook from Puebla included 5 variations of squash blossom quesadillas, each with a different chile or herb folded in alongside the cheese. One used hoja santa, which added a root beer-like fragrance that no other leaf could replicate. The recipe took less than 10 minutes because the blossom needed almost no cooking. Heat just long enough to soften, and the natural sweetness did everything else. When backyard gardens shrank and families moved to apartments, the supply of fresh blossoms dried up, and the quesadilla that depended on them became a rarity outside of farmers' markets. Number 19. Molletes. A bolillo sliced in half, spread thick with refried beans, topped with shredded cheese, and broiled or held face down over a comal until the cheese bubbled and browned at the edges. Molletes were the original Mexican open-face sandwich, and they appeared in cookbooks from every region. In the 1960s, bakeries in Monterrey and Guadalajara sold fresh bolillos every morning, and families bought them specifically for molletes at breakfast or as a late-night snack. The recipe needed no skill. A child could make them. But the result depended on the quality of the bread and the beans underneath. A good bolillo held the beans without going soggy. and the broiled cheese added a salty crust that crackled when you bit through it. Some families added pico de gallo, others kept it bare. Molletes were ready in 6 minutes and cost almost nothing. They faded as sliced sandwich bread replaced bolillos in many homes. But anywhere a real bakery still operates, molletes remain on the breakfast table. Number 18. Machaca con huevo. In the northern states of Sonora, Chihuahua, and Nuevo León, this was the breakfast that started nearly every working day. Dried, shredded beef rehydrated in a hot skillet with onion, tomato, and serrano chile, then scrambled with eggs until everything came together in a smoky, savory tangle. The beef had already been sun-dried and pounded thin, so the hard work was done long before anyone reached the stove. The actual cooking took 7 or 8 minutes. Old cookbooks from the Sonoran Desert listed machaca as a preservation technique first and a recipe second, because drying beef was how ranching families kept meat edible through the brutal summer heat before refrigeration arrived. The egg stretched a small amount of dried meat into a full meal for the whole table, and the tomato and chili kept it from feeling heavy. When refrigeration became universal, the need for dried beef disappeared, and machaca left most kitchens with it. In Hermosillo and Tucson, though, it never went anywhere. It was too good to give up just because the refrigerator showed up. Number 17. Sopa de ajo. Garlic soup sounds like something from a French bistro, but the Mexican version is older and far simpler. Whole cloves of garlic fried golden in a little oil, a handful of stale tortilla strips dropped into the pot, chicken broth poured over everything, and a raw egg cracked on top at the last moment to poach in the hot liquid. 8 minutes from start to table. The garlic infused the broth completely, and the tortilla strips softened into something halfway between noodles and dumplings. A 1965 cookbook from Guanajuato listed sopa de ajo as a remedy for colds, hangovers, and what the author called general sadness, which might have been the most honest piece of medical advice ever committed to paper. The soup disappeared from modern tables because it relied on stale tortillas, and today, most families throw those away instead of cooking with them. That single habit, saving yesterday's tortillas for today's meal, was the foundation of dozens of recipes that no longer exist. Number 16. Calabacitas con queso. Diced Mexican summer squash cooked in a skillet with fresh corn kernels cut from the cob, a little onion, and a roasted poblano pepper, then finished with a blanket of melted cheese pulled across the top. The squash cooked down in minutes, and the corn added a sweetness that balanced the mild heat of the pepper. Old cookbooks called this calabacitas a la mexicana and treated it as a side dish, but in homes across Zacatecas and Durango, it regularly served as the main course alongside a stack of fresh tortillas. The cheese was the key. Not a processed cheese from a plastic wrapper, but a real queso chihuahua, or asadero, that melted into long, stretchy strings when it hit the hot vegetables. Some families added a splash of cream at the end. Others dropped in a handful of epazote leaves for fragrance. The recipe faded from printed cookbooks around the same time pre-shredded cheese bags appeared in grocery stores, and somehow those two events feel connected. Number 15. Chilaquiles rojos. Stale tortillas torn by hand into rough triangles, fried until crisp, then drowned in a warm red salsa made from dried guajillo and ancho peppers. The chips softened just enough to absorb the sauce while keeping a bit of crunch at the center. Topped with crema, raw onion rings, and crumbled queso fresco. The entire dish came together in 10 minutes if the salsa was already made, and in most households it was, because salsa lived permanently on the back of the stove. Here is what most modern chilaquiles recipes get wrong. The old cookbook versions never called for tortilla chips from a bag. They specified yesterday's tortillas, torn and fried fresh that morning. A store-bought chip shatters and dissolves. A hand-fried tortilla piece bends, holds, and soaks without falling apart. a 1971 cookbook from Mexico City, devoted an entire page to the proper oil temperature for frying the tortilla pieces before they met the salsa. That level of care for a dish most people today treat as leftover chip cleanup is what made the old versions worth writing down. Number 14. Tortas de huevo en caldillo. This one deserves more time because it represents something larger than just a recipe. Tortas de huevo were egg patties, small rounds of beaten egg mixed with a pinch of flour, sometimes with diced nopal or ground dried shrimp folded in, fried golden on both sides, then simmered in a thin tomato broth seasoned with garlic and a single dried chile. The patties puffed up as they absorbed the broth, turning spongy and rich. 10 minutes from cracking the egg to sitting down with a full bowl. During Lent, tortas de huevo were the centerpiece of the Friday table in Catholic Mexican households across the entire Southwest. No meat meant that eggs carried the meal, and the caldillo, the thin broth, made a few eggs feel substantial enough to feed a large family on a single income. A 1958 Lenten cookbook from a parish in Laredo, Texas, included 7 variations of tortas de huevo, each meant for a different Friday. One used dried shrimp, another folded in strips of cactus paddle. A third mixed in breadcrumbs soaked in milk to make the patties fluffier and stretch them even further. The cookbook was mimeographed and handed out after Sunday Mass, and its recipes assumed you already knew how to make a basic tomato broth from scratch, because of course you did. What made tortas de huevo fade was not a lack of taste but a shift in how families observed Lent. Younger generations relaxed the Friday meat restriction, and without that weekly reason to reach for the recipe, the egg patties simply stopped appearing on the table. The broth was too plain for a generation raised on bolder, louder flavors, and the dish carried an association with religious duty rather than pleasure. But anyone who has eaten a properly made torta de huevo, still warm from the caldillo with its edges soaking up tomato and chile, knows that duty had nothing to do with why their grandmother kept making it every single Friday. She made it because it was one of the best things she knew how to cook. Which of these recipes did your own family make every week? Tell us in the comments. Number 13. Dulce de camote. Sweet potatoes peeled, boiled soft, mashed smooth with piloncillo and cinnamon, then shaped by hand into small logs and left to cool on a sheet of wax paper. The whole process took 10 minutes of active work, and the result was a candy that tasted like autumn in solid form. Street vendors in Puebla sold dulce de camote wrapped in tissue paper for centavos, and old cookbooks from the region listed it alongside other dulces made from fruit pastes and nut brittle as a standard after-dinner sweet. The camote version was the easiest of all because it needed no special molds, no candy thermometer, and no real cooking skill. Just a pot, a fork, and your hands. Some families added a few drops of lime juice to cut the sweetness, while others stirred in mashed guava for color and tartness. The candy disappeared from most home kitchens when commercially wrapped sweets became cheaper and more convenient than buying fresh camotes at the market. Number 12. Entomatadas. Entomatadas were the gentler sister of enchiladas. Instead of a spicy chile sauce, the tortillas were dipped in a fresh tomato sauce made from nothing more than roasted tomatoes blended with garlic and a single serrano pepper, lightly fried, folded into quarters, and arranged on a plate with crema and crumbled cheese on top. The tomato sauce had a brightness that chili sauce could never match, sweet and tangy at the same time. A 1967 cookbook from Michoacán listed entomatadas as a children's dish because the flavor was mild enough for young palates, but adults ate them just as happily and just as often. In many households, entomatadas were the default Tuesday dinner, the meal that appeared when no one had planned anything else, and the tomatoes on the counter needed using before they went soft. The recipe faded when enchiladas in green and red sauce became the standard at every restaurant, and entomatadas were left behind as somehow too simple to be taken seriously. that simplicity was always the point. Number 11. Caldo de huevo con hierba buena. Chicken broth brought to a full rolling boil, a few sprigs of fresh spearmint dropped in, and then eggs cracked directly into the pot to poach in the bubbling liquid. Salt, a squeeze of lime, and it was done. 6 minutes, maybe less. This was the recipe grandmothers made when someone in the house was sick or cold, or simply needed something warm and quiet. Old cookbooks from the 1950s listed it as caldo de enfermo, the broth for the ill. The mint was not decoration. It settled the stomach and made the broth fragrant enough to coax back an appetite that had gone missing. The eggs added body without heaviness. Families across Tamaulipas and Nuevo León kept bundles of dried mint hanging in the kitchen specifically for this purpose, ready at a moment's notice. It was medicine disguised as dinner, and it worked better than most things that came in a bottle. Number 10. Capirotada rápida. Capirotada is Mexican bread pudding, and the full ceremonial version takes well over an hour to bake. But old cookbooks contained a shortcut version that most families actually used during the week, and it came together in under 10 minutes without ever touching an oven. Stale bolillo rolls sliced thin and toasted in a dry skillet until they turned golden and firm. While they crisped, you made a quick syrup by dissolving a cone of piloncillo in water with a cinnamon stick and a few whole cloves. The syrup bubbled dark and fragrant, smelling like Christmas in the middle of March. You layered the toasted bread in a deep plate, poured the hot syrup over it, scattered peanuts, raisins, and chunks of queso fresco on top, and let it sit for 2 minutes while the bread absorbed everything. That was the dish. No oven, no long soaking, no waiting. The combination of sweet syrup and salty cheese is the part that surprises people who have never tried it. It sounds wrong until you taste it. The piloncillo has a deep molasses character that white sugar cannot touch, and the cheese melts just enough at the edges to create pockets of warm salt in every single bite. A 1961 cookbook from Zacatecas included a note next to the recipe that read, "The cheese is not optional," underlined twice. Capirotada was traditionally a Lenten dish, made on Fridays during the 40 days before Easter. Each ingredient carried religious symbolism: the bread for the body of Christ, the syrup for his blood, the cinnamon for the cross, the cloves for the nails. But the quick weekday version stripped away the ceremony and kept the flavor, and that was the version grandmothers actually made when they wanted something sweet without heating up the oven on a hot afternoon. Today, capirotada appears mostly at Easter, if it appears at all. The everyday shortcut version, the one that turned stale bread and a cone of raw sugar into dessert in 10 minutes flat, has been almost entirely forgotten. And that is the version that belonged in those old notebooks, because it proved that even day-old leftovers could become something truly worth remembering. Number 9. Tacos de papa. Mashed potatoes seasoned with salt, a little cumin, and sometimes a spoonful of crumbled chorizo, spooned into a corn tortilla, rolled tight, and fried in shallow oil until the shell crackled golden. Tacos de papa were the original 10-minute meal for families who needed to feed a crowd with whatever was already in the kitchen. Potatoes were always available and always affordable. A dozen tacos could be assembled and fried for less than a single cut of meat and fed just as many people. Old cookbooks from the 1970s in Guanajuato and San Luis Potosí listed them as tacos económicos, a name that carried no embarrassment whatsoever because everybody made them and everybody loved them. The fried shell was the real attraction. It shattered on the first bite and gave way to the soft, warm potato filling inside. Some families served them with a drizzle of crema and a spoonful of green salsa. Others just ate them standing at the counter, straight out of the oil, too impatient to wait for a plate. Number 8. Sopes de frijol. A sopa starts as a thick round of masa, cooked on a comal, then pinched around the edges while still hot to form a shallow raised rim. That rim is what separates it from a tortilla. You spread refried beans inside the rim, crumbled cheese on top, and finished with a line of salsa verde and a few rings of raw white onion. The pinching was the only tricky part, and experienced cooks did it with bare fingers hardened by years of handling hot dough straight from the comal. A 1966 cookbook from Oaxaca described the technique as pellizcar, to pinch, and noted that the rim should be just high enough to hold the beans, but not so tall that it looked like a bowl. Soaps faded from everyday cooking because they required fresh masa, and fresh masa required either a tortilleria within walking distance or a hand grinder at home. When neither was convenient, the soap was one of the first things to go from the weekly routine. Number 7. Rajas con crema, poblano. Peppers roasted directly over a gas flame until the skin blistered black, peeled under a damp cloth, sliced into long strips, and stirred into a pan of simmering cream with a little onion and fresh corn kernels. The cream thickened around the peppers and turned pale green from the residual heat of the chiles. Old cookbooks listed this as a filling for tacos, a topping for white rice, or simply a side dish eaten with tortillas, and all three uses were equally correct. The peppers had a mild smokiness that the cream softened further, creating something rich without feeling heavy. In Puebla, Rajas con crema appeared at every gathering from weddings to wakes. The recipe took 8 minutes once the peppers were charred. The dish has not vanished, but the version made with canned peppers and processed cream is a pale shadow of the original. Number 6. Habas con chile. Fava beans were a highland staple, and the simplest way to serve them took 7 minutes of active cooking. Dried habas soaked overnight, boiled tender, then tossed in a hot skillet with chopped onion, garlic, and a couple of dried chiles de árbol toasted until they blackened. A squeeze of lime, a sprinkle of coarse salt, and they were done. The beans had a starchy, earthy weight that paired with almost any salsa you put beside them. A 1963 cookbook from a convent in Querétaro listed habas con chile as a Friday meal alongside lentils and nopales, all served without meat as the rules required. Habas thrived in the central highlands from Tlaxcala to Hidalgo, where the altitude was right for growing them. They fell out of fashion as canned beans became easier, and dried fava beans became harder to find in ordinary grocery stores. In Mexican markets, you can still buy them by the kilo, exactly as they have been sold for centuries. Number 5. Atole de maizena. Cornstarch dissolved in cold milk, then heated slowly with a stick of cinnamon, a splash of vanilla, and enough sugar to sweeten it without making it heavy. Stirred for 10 minutes over medium heat, it thickened into a warm, smooth drink halfway between a beverage and a porridge. Atole de maizena was the simplified version of the traditional corn-based atole, adapted for kitchens that no longer had fresh nixtamalized corn. Old cookbooks from the 1950s and 1960s listed it as a breakfast drink for children and a nightcap for adults. In border towns from El Paso to Brownsville, families made it year-round, not just during the holidays. The warmth made it filling enough to serve as a meal on its own. You could flavor it with chocolate, strawberry, or guava, but the plain cinnamon version was the one most grandmothers defaulted to. The recipe faded when instant hot chocolate and packaged coffee took over, but the stovetop version had a comfort that no powder stirred into hot water could deliver. Number 4. Taquitos dorados. Corn tortillas filled with shredded chicken or leftover mashed potato, rolled tight as a cigarette, and fried in a 1/4 inch of oil until the shell turned golden and rigid. Taquitos dorados were party food, weeknight dinner, and after-school snack all at once, depending entirely on how many you made. A dozen could be assembled and fried in 10 minutes by anyone who had done it before, and most Mexican-American mothers had done it hundreds of times. A 1970 cookbook from a women's group in Tucson included a page titled Toreados for 50, with instructions for feeding an entire church hall using 3 cast iron skillets working at the same time. What made the homemade version different from the frozen taquitos that replaced it was the tortilla itself, a fresh corn tortilla softened on a hot comal before filling, fried into something with real layers and chew. A frozen taquito from a box crumbles into dust on the first bite. Number 3. Salsa macha. Oil-roasted Chile salsa. That is what salsa macha is at its core, and the name alone tells you it was not for the cautious. Dried morita or pasilla peppers fried slowly in oil alongside whole garlic cloves, raw peanuts, and sesame seeds until everything darkened and the kitchen filled with smoky, nutty heat. The mixture went into the molcajete, crushed just enough to break the seeds but never smooth. The oil stayed in and became part of the salsa. A 1964 cookbook from Veracruz listed salsa macha as a condiment that could last weeks in a jar on the counter, covered with a cotton cloth. It was the original shelf-stable hot sauce. The peanuts gave it body, the sesame added a toasty sweetness, and the chili delivered a slow burn that built over bites rather than hitting all at once. Salsa macha is experiencing a revival today at specialty shops, but at prices that would have made the women who invented it laugh out loud. Number 2. Requesón con epazote. Requesón is Mexican ricotta, a soft, crumbly, fresh curd cheese that was once a byproduct of making other cheeses and cost almost nothing at the market. Mixed with chopped epazote leaves, a pinch of salt, and a diced serrano pepper, it became a filling for tacos, a topping for tostadas, or a spread eaten with warm tortillas straight from the comal. 5 minutes, most of it spent chopping. Old cookbooks from Michoacán and Guerrero listed requesón as an everyday protein, as common as eggs, and cheaper than any cut of meat. The epazote added a pungent, almost medicinal flavor that newcomers either loved or needed time to appreciate, and the herb also helped with digestion, which explained its constant presence alongside beans in traditional recipes. Requesón became scarce in the United States as pasteurization regulations tightened and small-batch cheesemakers vanished. In Mexico, it remains widely available and still costs almost nothing. Number 1. Champurrado. If one recipe deserves to close this list, it is champurrado, a thick, warm drink made from masa harina dissolved in water, simmered with Mexican chocolate, piloncillo, cinnamon, and vanilla until it reached the consistency of a thin porridge. 10 minutes of stirring, and you had something that was simultaneously a beverage, a dessert, and a meal. Champurrado appeared in the oldest Mexican cookbooks in existence, some dating to the colonial era, and the recipe barely changed in 400 years. It was served at baptisms, posadas, roadside stands on cold mornings, and kitchen tables when there was nothing else to offer. The chocolate and the masa made it rich enough to sustain a person through a full day, and the piloncillo gave it a sweetness that felt earned rather than added. A 1955 family cookbook from San Luis Potosi included the instruction stir with love and patience, as your mother taught you. Today, champurrado mostly appears during the holidays, but there was a time when it showed up every morning, spooned from a clay pot by women who never measured a thing. They stirred until it looked right, and that kind of knowledge is what those old notebooks preserved. Those 30 recipes were never complicated. They were fast, honest, and they fed families who knew that good cooking had nothing to do with how much you spent. If your grandmother kept one of those old notebooks, you already know what was in it. Tell us in the comments which recipe brought back a memory. And if this felt like a visit to your Abuela's kitchen, hit like and subscribe so you never miss what we bring to the table next.